Welcome to Serial Killer Files. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're stepping back into the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where fog hung thick like a shroud over the East End, and terror stalked the night. This is the story of Jack the Ripper, a name that still sends chills down spines more than a century later. But how much do we really know about the man behind the legend? Let's unravel the mysteries that have captivated criminologists, historians, and amateur sleuths for generations. From the bloody cobblestones of Whitechapel to the highest corridors of power, this is a story that shook an empire and created the template for every serial killer investigation that followed. Fascinated by the minds and the methods behind infamous murders? Scoob, an AI-powered podcast platform, brings you Serial Killer Files, a gripping, binge-worthy series that explores the darkest depths of criminal history. From Charles Manson and Aileen Wuornos to Richard Ramirez and the East Area Rapist, every episode unravels not only the chilling crimes, but the twisted psychology, systemic failures, and law enforcement oversights that allowed these killers to evade capture. Short episodes, unsettling truths. This isn't just true crime. It's a forensic dive into the darkest recesses of human nature. Download Scoob today and join over 50,000 true crime enthusiasts nationwide who can't get enough. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to Serial Killer Fillers to stay updated with the latest podcasts on infamous serial killings, unsolved murder mysteries, and more. Returning to Jack the Ripper, our story begins not with blood, but with ink. Picture this. It's September 1888, and the residents of London are waking up to their morning newspapers, steaming cups of tea in hand, only to discover that their city has been harboring something far more sinister than the usual pickpockets and drunks of the East End. The Central News Agency had received a letter that would birth one of history's most infamous monikers. The author proclaimed a chilling animosity toward prostitutes, vowed to continue his killing spree, and signed off with a name that has echoed through the corridors of criminal history: Jack the Ripper. But here's what's fascinating. Before this letter arrived on September 27th, the killer was known by much more mundane names. The press called him simply the Whitechapel Murderer, or sometimes Leather Apron. It was only after what became known as the double event, 2 murders in one night, that the name Jack the Ripper took hold of the public imagination like a fever. Now, why Jack? This wasn't some random choice scrawled in desperation. William Stewart, a keen observer of criminal history, proposed something intriguing. The name might have been influenced by the notorious criminals of the past who shared this moniker. You see, Victorian England was obsessed with criminal legends, and Jack had quite the pedigree. Consider Jack Sheppard, the legendary burglar and prison escapee who met his end at Tyburn in 1724. Though long dead by the Ripper's time, Sheppard's legend had been resurrected in 1839 through William Harrison Ainsworth's best-selling novel. The story captured public imagination so completely that it spawned countless novels, chapbooks, and dramas throughout the century. The authorities were so concerned about the moral impact of these tales that they actually discouraged stage productions based on Sheppard's life. Yet the fascination persisted. As late as 1885, actress Nellie Farren was drawing crowds at the Gaiety Theatre with her portrayal in Little Jack Sheppard. Wow! Then there was 16-String Jack, John Rann, the highwayman who earned his nickname from his peculiar habit of adorning his breeches with silk strings. His fame had dimmed by the 1880s, but echoes of his notoriety lingered. Even J.M. Barrie, the future creator of Peter Pan, had been nicknamed 16-String Jack as a child in the 1870s. Such was his love for thrilling adventure tales. But perhaps most tellingly, there was Spring-Heeled Jack, a phantom-like figure who had terrorized London in 1837 to 38. This mysterious entity, known for his outlandish costumes and frightening assaults on women and children, was never caught. He became entrenched in local folklore as a sort of bogeyman, his name still invoked by parents to frighten children into good behavior during the Ripper's era. It's entirely conceivable that our letter writer, steeped in this tradition of sensational literature, those penny dreadfuls that Victorian youth devoured, would naturally conjure the name Jack as his alias. The name carried weight, history, and most importantly, fear. And what about Ripper? This wasn't metaphorical. It was brutally literal. The term came directly from the killer's gruesome methodology, his signature act of opening up his victims' abdomens. This horrific practice was first witnessed with Polly Nichols, and the term Ripper began appearing in newspapers almost immediately. Interestingly, there were already whispers of ripping in the East End before our killer made his mark. Early reports mentioned a gang called the High Rip, involved in extorting money from street prostitutes. There was also talk of someone called Leather Apron, who had allegedly threatened a woman named Widow Annie with disembowelment. Home Office reports from September 19th documented threats involving Ripper-like acts with long knives. All these elements, the literary tradition of criminal jacks, the brutal methodology, the existing underworld slang, coalesced into the creation of Jack the Ripper, a persona that transcended the man himself to become something far more terrifying, a legend. Now let's turn to the victims themselves, starting with the woman many consider to be the Ripper's first canonical victim, Mary Ann Nichols, known to all as Polly. Picture the early morning of August 31st, 1888. Charles Cross and Robert Paul are making their way to work through the narrow, poorly lit streets of the East End. As they navigate through Buck's Row, they stumble upon something that would etch their names into criminal history forever: the lifeless body of Polly Nichols. These two working men, concerned about the woman's dignity even in death, arranged her clothing to cover her before continuing westward toward Baker's Row, seeking the first policeman they could find. But who was Polly Nichols? Her story is heartbreakingly typical of so many women in Victorian London's East End. Born Mary Ann Walker in 1845, in Fetter Lane near Fleet Street, her early life held promise. She married William Nichols, a printer, in 1864 at St. Bride's Church, and they had 5 children together. But this wasn't a fairy tale. Their union was fraught with discord, marked by several separations before they finally parted ways for good in 1880. The blame game that followed their separation tells us much about Victorian attitudes toward women and morality. Polly's father claimed William's infidelity with the family's young midwife drove them apart. William, however, blamed Polly's alleged alcoholism. The truth, as so often happens, probably lay somewhere in between. With her marriage dissolved, Polly faced the harsh reality that confronted so many women of her time. She had to fend for herself while William retained custody of their children. Initially, he provided her with a weekly allowance of 5 shillings, but this lifeline was severed around 1882 when he learned of her engagement in prostitution. What followed was a descent into the hellish world of Victorian London's safety net for the destitute. Polly navigated between workhouses and infirmaries, institutions that were deliberately designed to be punitive. These places were characterized by vermin-infested sleeping quarters and back-breaking manual labor. When her means allowed, she could afford a bed in a doss house, but even these establishments were far from comfortable. Her situation deteriorated further in 1887 when she was arrested for vagrancy while sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square. This led to yet another stint in the workhouse, a cycle that seemed impossible to break. There was a brief moment of hope in May 1888 when she secured employment with an affluent family in Wandsworth. Here was a chance for stability, for redemption, for a different path. But it ended abruptly when she departed suddenly, allegedly taking some clothing with her. Her employers, who abstained from alcohol, likely found her drinking habits incompatible with their household. At the subsequent inquest, even her own father described her as a reprobate and habitual drunkard destined for misfortune. Harsh words that speak to the moral judgments of the era and perhaps the desperation of a father watching his daughter's destruction. In the summer of 1888, Polly gravitated toward the lodging houses of Spitalfields, that warren of narrow streets and overcrowded buildings that served as home to London's forgotten masses. She initially shared accommodations with another prostitute in a doss house on Thrall Street. Later, she moved to the infamous White House on Flower and Dean Street, where beds were often shared between women and men, an arrangement that speaks to both the desperate poverty and the blurred moral boundaries of this world. Finally, she returned to Wilmot's on Thrall Street, where she spent her final night. When death found her, Mary Ann Nichols was 42 years old, a woman of small stature at 5 feet 2 inches, with graying brown hair and poor dental health, many teeth missing from both her upper and lower jaws. These physical details, recorded by the authorities, paint a picture of a hard life that had aged her beyond her years. Her death marked the beginning of something unprecedented in criminal history. The brutality of the attack, the precision of the mutilation, the sheer audacity of committing such an act in the streets of London, all of this announced the arrival of a killer unlike any the world had seen before. Now we come to one of the most contentious aspects of the Ripper case. Exactly how many victims can we attribute to this killer? The Victorian investigators themselves couldn't agree, and their disagreements have echoed through the decades, creating a debate that continues to this day. Let's start with the extreme positions. At one end, Inspector Reed believed that all 9 Whitechapel murders could be attributed to the Ripper, a sweeping conclusion that would make our killer one of the most prolific in history. At the opposite pole stood Superintendent Arnold, who thought the infamous killer was responsible for no more than 4 deaths: Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Mary Kelly. Arnold's conservative view may have been influenced by Dr. Phillips, the medical examiner who conducted or attended the post-mortems for the last 6 murders in the series. Dr. Phillips was a careful, methodical man who let the evidence guide his conclusions. He was certain that Alice Mackenzie and Frances Coles were not victims of the Ripper, and he harbored significant doubts about including Kate Eddowes in the canonical list. In a meticulously considered letter written in 1889, Dr. Phillips delivered what amounts to a professional bombshell. There wasn't sufficient anatomical and professional evidence to confirm that all the murders attributed to the Ripper were the work of a single individual. His doubts were based on the differing methods of attack and the varying motivations behind the gruesome mutilations he observed. This wasn't a man given to sensationalism. This was a medical professional raising serious questions about the fundamental assumption underlying the entire investigation. But other officials took different positions. Sir Melville Macnaghten settled on 5 victims, creating what we now call the Canonical 5: Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Kate Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. This list has gained wide acceptance among modern Ripperologists and represents a kind of middle ground in the debate. Inspector Aberline and Sir Robert Anderson pushed the count to 6 by including Martha Tabram alongside Macnaghten's 5. Walter Dew went even further, agreeing with these 6, but adding Emma Smith as the first victim, bringing his total to 7. Dr. Bond, who had the unique advantage of personally examining Mary Kelly and Alice Mackenzie while reviewing the medical notes from 4 earlier victims, believed all 6 were killed by the same hand. His medical opinion carried considerable weight, given his direct involvement with the evidence. The lack of unanimous agreement among these contemporaries, men who were there, who saw the evidence firsthand, who walked the crime scenes, tells us just how complex and ambiguous the evidence really was. When we look at the evidence with modern eyes, a reasonable analysis supports at least 4 murders as unquestionably the work of Jack the Ripper: Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Kate Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. It's also reasonable to consider Martha Tabram and Liz Stride as likely victims, though both cases present complications. Martha Tabram's case is particularly intriguing. The major argument against including her revolves around the nature of her injuries. Her throat wasn't cut in the typical Ripper fashion, nor was there any attempt at disembowelment, hallmarks of the later murders. However, John Ogan, a respected expert on the Whitechapel murders, has identified similarities in motivation. He notes the way Martha's clothes were manipulated to expose her lower torso, suggesting a sexual or psychological component to the attack. Dr. Colleen found no signs of sexual assault on Martha, leading to the theory that the intent was to disfigure the corpse. This hypothesis is supported by a 3-inch by 1-inch cut on her lower abdomen, a wound that could represent the killer's first tentative attempt at the mutilations that would become his signature. Yet Martha suffered 39 separate wounds, inflicted with 2 different weapons. This suggests either a frenzied, uncontrolled attack, very different from the calculated precision of later murders, or possibly multiple attackers. If the latter theory holds validity, then Privates Leary and Law, soldiers who were in the area that night, emerge as potential suspects for Martha's murder specifically. The debate over victim count isn't merely academic. It speaks to fundamental questions about the killer's psychology, his methods, and his evolution. Did he start tentatively with Martha and grow bolder? Did he perfect his technique over time? Or were some of these crimes the work of different hands entirely, coincidentally occurring in the same area during the same period? This uncertainty, this inability to definitively answer what seems like a basic question, is part of what makes the Ripper case so enduringly fascinating. Even the experts who were there, who had access to evidence we can only read about, couldn't agree. And perhaps that's the most chilling aspect of all, the possibility that the truth about Jack the Ripper died with him, leaving us forever grasping at shadows in the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. Obsessed with cold cases and serial killers who vanished without a trace? Scoob offers podcasts that dive deep into the world's most haunting mysteries, from Jack the Ripper, Step to the Zodiac Killer, and more. From historic horrors to modern-day mysteries, uncover the red flags, missed leads, and eerie patterns that link some of the most infamous killings. Tune in to Scoob, where the trail may be cold, but the story burns bright. Now let's explore a Whitechapel murder that still stands out, not just for its savagery, but for the disturbing questions it left behind. None has captured the imagination quite like the death of Mary Jane Kelly. Her case stands apart not just for its shocking brutality, but for the questions it raises about the killer himself. Was this the work of the same man who had terrorized the East End for months, or had someone else discovered Kelly in her squalid room in Miller's Court? Let's examine the evidence that links Kelly's murder to the previous victims. All were prostitutes who suffered the same fundamental fate, their throats cut with savage efficiency. The murders occurred within a tight geographical area, predominantly in the early morning hours when the streets were at their emptiest. Each victim was killed with a knife, and with the exception of Nichols and Tabram, all bodies were severely mutilated. There's a compelling theory that explains the escalation we see from victim to victim. Perhaps the early murders were tentative attempts, with the killer's confidence and morbid compulsion growing with each successive killing. This would explain why the mutilations became progressively more extensive, culminating in the horrific brutality inflicted upon Mary Kelly. Specific wound patterns suggest connections between Kelly's murder and that of Kate Eddowes. Both victims experienced cutting and nicking around the eyelids, a detail so specific it's unlikely to be coincidental. Both also suffered mutilation of the upper thighs. Internal organs were removed from Kelly, Eddowes, and Nichols, though in Kelly's case, the organs remained at the scene rather than being taken away. The evidence suggests that most victims were rendered unconscious before death, possibly through strangulation. Kelly might have been asleep due to intoxication when her killer struck. All were presumably engaged in solicitation when they encountered their murderer, following the tragic pattern of predator meeting prey in the darkest corners of Victorian London. But Kelly's murder also presents troubling anomalies. Most significantly, she was found undressed, suggesting that she had prepared for a sexual encounter. Unlike the outdoor attacks on previous victims, Kelly was murdered in her own room, a private space where her killer could work without fear of interruption. This raises crucial questions. Did Kelly know her murderer? If so, she might have felt comfortable enough in his presence to undress and possibly lie on the bed. Was this someone she trusted, perhaps because he had promised significant payment? Or was this simply an opportunistic encounter where a street prowler met a prostitute who offered the luxury of privacy? The removal and placement of organs in Kelly's case differs markedly from previous murders. While Eddowes and Nichols showed evidence of anatomical knowledge in the precision of organ removal, Kelly's case presents a different picture. Though organs were indeed removed, there was no indication of anatomical precision, nor were the organs taken from the scene. This suggests either a different killer or an evolution in the original killer's methods and motivations. Now, let's examine the crime scene itself, because what investigators found in Kelly's room tells a story beyond the obvious horror. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline returned to Miller's Court on Saturday morning, carefully examining the cold ashes in the grate. What he discovered was evidence of a substantial fire, intense enough to melt the spout of Kelly's kettle. The Times reported finding remnants of burnt velvet, believed to be from a jacket, along with the charred rim and wire framework of a woman's felt hat. Aberline's testimony at the inquest mentioned remnants of a skirt and hat brim among the ashes. This raises an intriguing question. What was the purpose of this fire? Aberline concluded that the killer had used the fire to illuminate the room sufficiently to carry out his gruesome work, as only one candle was found in the room. But this explanation raises its own questions. Why burn clothing for light when candles would have been readily available? Was the killer destroying evidence? Or was there something more psychological at work? A ritualistic element to the destruction? The medical examination of Kelly's remains was conducted by Drs. Thomas Bond, George Bagster Phillips, and Dr. Gordon Brown. Initially, reports suggested that all of Kelly's organs were accounted for after Dr. Phillips arranged the dismembered body parts. But by the following week, these reports had changed. The Daily Telegraph stated confidently that parts of the body's organs were missing, despite earlier claims to the contrary. The actions of the medical professionals tell us more than their initial reports. On Saturday afternoon, hours after the post-mortem, Dr. Phillips and Dr. Roderick MacDonald returned to the crime scene. There they sifted through the ashes from the grate using a sieve, searching for evidence of incinerated human remains. This suggests that Kelly's body had not been found entirely intact, despite initial reports. Dr. Thomas Bond's newly discovered post-mortem notes finally resolved this confusion, providing the most accurate account of the autopsy findings. These notes describe injuries of unprecedented savagery. Kelly's throat had been cut so deeply that tissues were severed down to the spinal column, with the fifth and sixth vertebrae deeply scored by the knife. Her airway was severed at the lower part of the larynx through the cricoid cartilage. The facial mutilations were horrific beyond description. Her face was gashed in multiple directions, with the nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears partially removed. Her lips were blanched and marked by several cuts running downward toward the chin. Every facial feature bore the marks of deliberate, methodical destruction. But it was the atrocities inflicted upon her torso and limbs that represented a height of brutality not yet witnessed in the Ripper's previous crimes. The level of mutilation suggested either a killer losing all restraint or someone with an entirely different psychological makeup from the perpetrator of the earlier murders. The photographs taken of Kelly's body, potentially among the earliest instances of crime scene photography used by British police, capture the shocking reality of the crime. These images, more than any written description, convey the horror that the murder instilled in Victorian society. It's difficult to imagine how the killer could have committed a more heinous act. Kelly's funeral became a significant public event, with thousands gathering to express their sympathy and grief as the procession made its way to St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone. In death, this forgotten woman of the East End became a symbol of both the vulnerability of the dispossessed and the capacity for human evil. November 9, 1888 marked not just the death of Mary Kelly, but a convergence of events that would reshape the very investigation into the Whitechapel murders. As news of Kelly's horrific death spread across London, another bombshell was detonating in the corridors of power. Sir Charles Warren, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, had resigned. Queen Victoria herself had been monitoring the developments in the East End with growing alarm. After Kelly's murder, she felt compelled to send a telegram to her ministers that revealed the extent of royal concern. This new most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity for some very decided action. All these courts must be lit, and our detectives improved. They are not what they should be. You promised, when the first murders took place, to consult with your colleagues about it. Warren had endured months of harsh criticism from radical newspapers throughout the period of the Whitechapel murders. His relationship with Henry Matthews, the Home Secretary, had deteriorated to the point of open hostility. The final straw came when Warren penned a candid article about police work for Murray's magazine. Matthews reprimanded him for this unauthorized publication, and Warren concluded he had reached his limit. His resignation was submitted and promptly accepted. While Warren's departure wasn't directly caused by the police failure to capture the Ripper, public perception has forever linked Jack the Ripper's crimes to this high-level political casualty. The symbolism was powerful. The killer had claimed not just lives, but careers at the highest levels of government. What the public didn't know in November 1888 was that Mary Kelly would be Jack the Ripper's final victim, at least according to most modern experts. Instead of an ending, Kelly's murder was viewed as a further escalation in a series that seemed to have no bounds. The expectation was that worse was yet to come. But the Ripper's reign of terror was over, even if the fear he had generated would persist for years. The hysteria he had created was so intense that virtually any violent act against women in the following years was attributed to him. This psychological legacy proved almost as powerful as the original crimes themselves. Two later murders particularly captured public attention as potential Ripper killings, those of Alice Mackenzie and Francis Coles. Alice Mackenzie's death in July 1889 sparked intense debate among the very officials who had investigated the original murders. Mackenzie's case shared troubling similarities with the Canonical murders. She was killed months after the Ripper had apparently ceased his activities, found with 2 stab wounds to her throat in a dingy alley off Whitechapel High Street. Like the other victims, she was a prostitute living in the desperate conditions of East End doss houses. Her killer had attempted to tear her clothing and had inflicted superficial wounds to her abdomen and genital area. The professional opinion was sharply divided. Sir Robert Anderson, Inspector Aberline, and Dr. George Bagster Phillips argued that Mackenzie had fallen victim to a different killer. But Dr. Thomas Bond and Police Commissioner James Monroe believed she was another Ripper victim. This division of expert opinion has persisted among modern researchers, with no clear consensus emerging. Mackenzie's story begins on July 16, 1889, when this woman, known for her occasional drunkenness, ventured out to the Cambridge Music Hall in the East End. A blind boy heard her asking a man to buy her a drink, the last time she would be seen alive. At nearly 1 a.m., her body was discovered in Castle Alley, Whitechapel, throat slashed and clothing raised to reveal severe abdominal mutilations. Dr. Thomas Bond, who conducted the autopsy, expressed his belief that Mackenzie's killer was the same person responsible for the earlier Whitechapel murders. Yet unlike the Canonical murders, Mackenzie's case generated minimal public discussion about Jack the Ripper. Perhaps the public had moved on, or perhaps the horror had become routine. Other violent deaths occurred that seemed to echo the Ripper's methods. Less than a month after Mackenzie's murder, tragedy struck England's northeast coast in Seaham Harbor, near Newcastle upon Tyne. 8-year-old Caroline Winner was found with her skull brutally crushed, her body showing other horrific injuries, discovered in a pool of water near a sewer. Caroline had last been seen playing with a friend who told police that Caroline had been speaking to a man with black hair and a black mustache, dressed in a shabby gray suit. This stranger had offered Caroline a shilling to accompany him, an offer she accepted with tragic consequences. The crime was never solved, leaving another mystery in the wake of the Ripper hysteria. A female torso discovered on September 10th under a railway arch at Pinchin Street initially sparked Ripper speculation. However, despite being dismembered, it showed none of the typical mutilation patterns, nor was there evidence of a throat cut, even though the head was missing. Official reports suggested this was unlikely the Ripper's work, as the dismemberment appeared accidental rather than displaying the vicious precision associated with the infamous killer. Perhaps most intriguingly, decomposing human remains surfaced at the docks of Middlesbrough on December 13, 1889, just south of Seaham Harbor, where Caroline Winner had been killed. Among these remains was a woman's right hand, notably missing 2 joints of the little finger. This detail becomes significant when we consider that on December 4, 1888, someone claiming to be the Ripper had written about trying to remove and send a finger if successful. The final murder commonly associated with the Ripper occurred on February 13, 1891, when Frances Coles, a prostitute, was discovered in Swallow Gardens, Whitechapel, her throat cut. She was described as around 26 years old and of habitual drunkenness. Dr. George Phillips, who examined her body, noted that it was not mutilated and did not connect it to the earlier murder series. Like so many cases from this period, Cole's murder remains unsolved, adding another layer to the mystery. Each of these post-Kelly murders demonstrates how the Ripper had fundamentally changed the landscape of criminal investigation in London. Every violent death was viewed through the lens of his crimes, every mutilation compared to his methods. The psychological impact of Jack the Ripper extended far beyond his actual victims. He had created a template for fear that would influence how society viewed serial killers for generations to come. The very fact that murders years later were still being attributed to him shows the enduring power of the terror he had unleashed on Victorian London. Now let's turn our attention to the killer himself, not his identity, which remains shrouded in mystery, but his methods, his psychology, and what modern forensic science can tell us about the man who terrorized Whitechapel. One of the most debated aspects of the Ripper case has been whether the killer was left-handed, right-handed, or possibly ambidextrous. This might seem like a minor detail, but in the world of criminal investigation, such specifics can provide crucial insights into a perpetrator's identity and methods. The debate originated from early medical examinations of the victims. Sir Melville Macnaghten noted that speculation about the murderer's left-handedness came from a remark made by a doctor who examined one of the early victims. However, other medical professionals disagreed with this assessment, highlighting the conflicting nature of the evidence, even among contemporary experts. Reports from the Westminster notes indicated that the throats in the first 4 murders were cut from left to right, suggesting a right-handed killer. This analysis assumed the women were in a prone position when murdered, which would make the direction of the cut a reliable indicator of the killer's dominant hand. Professor Cameron from the Department of Forensic Medicine at the London Hospital examined this theory using illustrations and photographs from Mitre Square, where Kate Eddowes was killed. The way the incision dragged to the right and deepened as internal organs were exposed supported the notion of a right-handed attacker. Both Professor Cameron and his predecessor, Professor Camps, believed the killer likely began by strangling his victims, a theory that would have significant implications for understanding his methods. The strangulation theory is particularly compelling because it addresses several puzzling aspects of the crimes. In at least 2 instances, obstructions to the mouth were observed, and there was notably little blood spatter around the crime scenes, suggesting minimal struggling by the victims. Strangulation would explain both phenomena. It would silence victims quickly and reduce their ability to fight back. Professor Camps highlighted a crucial flaw in the original investigations. The medical professionals and police tended to accept the obvious rather than delve deeper into alternative explanations. In many cases of sadistic sexual murder, strangulation is a significant component, yet the Victorian investigators focused primarily on the knife wounds, while largely ignoring potential signs of strangulation. This oversight was perhaps understandable given the working conditions. Most autopsies were performed in ill-equipped makeshift facilities like workhouse mortuaries. Dr. Phillips and the coroner expressed strong dissent about these inadequate conditions during the initial inquests. Under such circumstances, it's somewhat understandable that doctors might focus on the most obvious evidence rather than pursuing more subtle signs of strangulation. Strangulation typically leaves specific indicators, petechiae, small pinprick hemorrhages around the eyes and face, and potential damage to the laryngeal area, particularly fractures to the hyoid bone. These signs might have been overlooked in the poorly lit, hastily conducted examinations of the time. Modern criminal profiling provides additional insights into the Ripper's psychology and methods. The FBI categorizes serial killers into 2 primary types, disorganized and organized offenders, each displaying distinct behavioral patterns that can provide crucial investigative leads. A disorganized offender typically acts impulsively without prior planning or victim stalking. Their crime scenes show signs of chaos, bodies left exposed, weapons and evidence abandoned, clear indicators of spontaneous violence. These killers are often loners, socially awkward, unemployed, or working in low-skilled jobs requiring minimal human interaction. An organized offender, conversely, meticulously plans their crimes. They carefully select and track victims beforehand, maintaining control over the crime scene, taking precautions to avoid leaving evidence, sometimes even transporting and concealing bodies elsewhere. These individuals are typically intelligent, well-spoken, often educated, with steady careers and potentially stable relationships. FBI profiler John Douglas might categorize Jack the Ripper as a disorganized offender, but this classification requires careful consideration. The Ripper displayed traits of both categories, what we might call a mixed offender. His apparent single status, operation within a confined local area, and tendency to leave bodies in plain view align with the disorganized profile. However, his ability to engage victims in conversation, the calculated evolution of his methods, and his success in avoiding capture suggest organized characteristics. David Canner, a noted professor of psychology at the University of Surrey and a key figure in UK offender profiling, offers a different perspective. Canner proposes that Jack the Ripper held a strong sense of alienation from society, channeling his fury and resentment toward vulnerable targets. The killer likely had a history of psychological issues that would have been apparent to those around him. According to Canner's analysis, the Ripper's social circle would have viewed him as reclusive and emotionally challenging to connect with. While marriage was possible, any relationship would have deviated significantly from societal norms. His employment would likely have required certain skills while providing the limited social interaction necessary for his initial engagements with potential victims. Cantor strongly believes the Ripper resided or maintained a base in the Whitechapel area, a theory supported by the geographical clustering of the crimes. More importantly, he suggests that the first murder attributed to the Ripper was not his debut criminal act. This hypothesis has significant implications for investigative approaches. Both Douglas and Cantor suggest that the Ripper may have been involved in other criminal activities in the Whitechapel area prior to the murders. This theory invites examination of local magistrate court records from the 5 years before the documented murders began. Such investigation might reveal a suspect with a history of offenses like indecent assault or street robbery, fitting the established psychological profiles. The evolution of the killer's methods also provides insights into his psychology. The progression from Polly Nichols' relatively simple throat wound to Mary Kelly's extensive mutilation suggests either growing confidence or escalating psychological deterioration. The killer appears to have been learning, experimenting, becoming bolder with each attack. The choice of victims, all vulnerable women engaged in prostitution, speaks to the killer's targeting of society's most defenseless members. This pattern suggests someone who felt powerless in other aspects of life, finding victims who were even more powerless than himself. The geographical pattern of the murders, concentrated within a small area of Whitechapel, indicates local knowledge and comfort with the terrain. This wasn't someone passing through London on business. This was someone who knew these streets intimately, who understood the patterns of police patrols, who could navigate the maze of alleys and courts with confidence. Modern profiling techniques, while invaluable, must be applied carefully to historical cases. The Victorian social context, investigative methods, and available evidence differ significantly from modern crime scenes. Yet the fundamental aspects of criminal psychology remain consistent across centuries, making these analytical approaches valuable tools for understanding history's most notorious killer. On November 8, 1889, exactly 1 year after Mary Kelly's murder, something extraordinary arrived at Great Scotland Yard. An 81-line poem sent to the superintendent, purportedly from Jack the Ripper himself. While the authorities largely dismissed it, along with hundreds of other communications they received, this particular document offers fascinating insights into the mind of someone intimately familiar with the Whitechapel murders. The poem reveals a voice dripping with eerie pride and satisfaction. The author speaks of the various roles he assumes, expressing an almost theatrical delight in eluding capture. He writes of moving swiftly through the streets, leaving no evidence behind, describing his primary goal as the eradication of the destitute women who roam the night, those society has neglected, belittled, and driven into the darker corners of existence. What makes this poem particularly intriguing is its sophisticated language and detailed knowledge of the investigation. The author demonstrates familiarity with the crime scenes, the victims, and even specific interactions with police officers. He gleefully recounts conversations with policemen, describing these encounters with an unsettling mixture of bravado and dark humor. In one particularly chilling passage, the poem describes the author conversing with a policeman who referred to a nearby crime scene as the handiwork of a knacker at night. The term knacker, referring to a horse slaughterer, was derogatory slang of the time. The poem's author relates how he told the officer that capturing the perpetrator should be a priority, to which the policeman jokingly warned him against saying more or risk arrest himself. This interaction, if genuine, suggests remarkable audacity on the killer's part, returning to crime scenes, engaging with the very officers investigating his crimes, perhaps even offering opinions on the investigation itself. The psychological profile this suggests is of someone who derived pleasure not just from the killings themselves, but from the entire experience of being hunted while remaining invisible. The poem also describes a late-night encounter with a policeman along High Street, where the author bought the officer a drink and they walked together quietly through the streets. This image, killer and investigator sharing a drink, walking side by side through the very streets where terror had stalked, is both absurd and deeply unsettling. Despite the sophisticated language and insider knowledge demonstrated in the poem, authorities dismissed it as another hoax. Yet the poem's hints, such as mentions of theaters and music halls where prostitutes were often seen, were overlooked as potential investigative leads. These locations were regular haunts for certain suspects, including artists and men about town, who might move comfortably in such environments. The author denies any mental imbalance, countering widespread rumors about his psychological state. He asserts his solitary nature, refuting speculation that he might work with an accomplice. Interestingly, he claims abstention from tobacco and excessive alcohol, painting a picture at odds with typical assumptions about a deranged killer. Instead, this self-portrait suggests someone disciplined, controlled, and methodical. The poem demonstrates the author's claim to be self-taught yet capable of reading and writing proficiently. The text flows between street slang and literary flourishes, showing familiarity with both the crude vernacular of the East End and more sophisticated forms of expression. This linguistic versatility suggests someone who could move between different social classes, adapting his speech and manner to his surroundings. One particularly intriguing detail is the author's reference to himself as capable of avoiding detection while mixing different language styles. The use of terms like knacker might have confused authorities. It could have been miswritten as knocker, a term denoting pretentious fashion. This linguistic complexity suggests either genuine education or careful study of different social registers. The poem's structure and style, while not exhibiting exceptional poetic talent, show competence in verse construction. The author seems more comfortable with visual imagery than complex meter, perhaps suggesting someone whose primary talents lay elsewhere, possibly in the visual arts rather than literature. What makes this poem particularly compelling is its timing, arriving exactly 1 year after what most experts consider the Ripper's final murder. This anniversary timing could be coincidental, but it might also suggest someone marking a significant personal milestone. The psychological significance of anniversaries to serial killers is well documented in modern criminology. The detailed knowledge displayed in the poem goes beyond what was publicly available in newspaper accounts. The author demonstrates familiarity with police procedures, investigation methods, and specific details about crime scenes that were not widely reported. This insider knowledge suggests either genuine involvement in the crimes or close contact with someone who was involved. The tone throughout the poem is one of superiority and contempt, not just for the victims, but for the entire investigation. The author presents himself as intellectually superior to the police, the press, and the public. This narcissistic element fits well with modern psychological profiles of serial killers, who often view themselves as playing a complex game with law enforcement. Perhaps most unsettling is the poem's complete lack of remorse or humanity. The victims are described not as individuals with their own stories and tragedies, but as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved. This dehumanization of the victims reveals a psychological coldness that goes beyond mere criminal violence into something approaching pure sociopathy. The poem ends with the author expressing confidence in his ability to continue evading capture, suggesting he might strike again. Yet history tells us that Mary Kelly was indeed the final canonical victim. This disconnect between the poem's bravado and the apparent cessation of murders raises intriguing questions. Did the killer die? Flee London? Simply stop killing? Or was this poem itself evidence that someone other than the actual killer was seeking to maintain the legend? While we cannot definitively prove the poem's authorship, its sophisticated knowledge, psychological insights, and eerie familiarity with the investigation make it one of the most compelling pieces of communication attributed to Jack the Ripper. Whether genuine or the work of an extremely well-informed hoaxer, it provides a chilling glimpse into the mind of someone intimately connected with history's most notorious unsolved crimes. Haunted by the unanswered questions of the Ripper case? You're not alone. For those captivated by the shadows of history's most infamous cold cases and serial killings, Scoob is your next obsession. Now available on the App Store and Google Play, Scoob offers immersive deep-dive podcasts that unravel the mysteries behind unsolved murders, investigative missteps, and notorious cases like John Benet Ramsey, the Lindbergh kidnapping, and more. Download Scoob today and follow the clues others left behind. As we reach the end of our journey through the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian Whitechapel, we're left with more questions than answers. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Jack the Ripper's true power lay not just in the lives he took, but in the mystery he created, a puzzle that has proved impossible to solve despite more than a century of investigation. Think about what we've discovered today. A name born from sensational literature and brutal methodology that captured the public imagination like a fever. Victims whose tragic stories reveal the harsh realities of Victorian life for society's most vulnerable members. Investigators and medical professionals who couldn't agree on basic facts, even while the evidence was fresh before them. A killer who may have been organized or disorganized, right-handed or left-handed, a solitary predator or someone capable of walking among police officers undetected. We've seen how the Ripper changed not just criminal investigation, but popular culture itself. He created the template for how we think about serial killers, established crime scene photography as an investigative tool, and demonstrated how mass media could amplify fear across an entire city. The very fact that murders years after Mary Kelly were still being attributed to him shows the psychological landscape he had permanently altered. Perhaps most remarkably, we've explored how the Ripper's crimes reached the highest levels of government, compelling Queen Victoria herself to demand action and ultimately contributing to the resignation of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. In an age when violent crime was common, the Ripper somehow transcended ordinary criminal activity to become something approaching a force of nature. The victims, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Kate Eddowes, Mary Kelly, and possibly Martha Tabram, each had their own story, their own struggles, their own humanity. They weren't just statistics in a criminal investigation. They were women whose lives had value and meaning beyond their tragic ends. Their stories remind us that behind every sensational criminal case are real people whose lives were cut short by unimaginable violence. The investigators, too, were real people, doing their best with limited resources and primitive forensic techniques. Their disagreements weren't signs of incompetence, but evidence of the complex, ambiguous nature of the crimes they were trying to solve. Dr. Phillips' careful skepticism, Inspector Aberline's dogged determination, Sir Melville Macnaghten's analytical approach, each contributed to our understanding while highlighting the limitations of their era's investigative methods. Modern criminal profiling offers new insights into the Ripper's possible psychology and methods, but it cannot definitively solve a case where so much evidence has been lost to time. The geographic clustering of crimes, the evolution of the killer's methods, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, all these factors paint a picture of someone who was both calculating and savage, organized and chaotic. The poetry attributed to the Ripper, whether genuine or an elaborate hoax, provides perhaps our most chilling glimpse into the mind connected with these crimes. The sophisticated language, insider knowledge, and complete lack of remorse revealed. In those 81 lines create a psychological portrait that is both compelling and deeply disturbing. What lessons can we draw from this exploration? Perhaps the most important is that some mysteries resist solution not because of investigative failures, but because the truth itself may be irrecoverable. The Ripper case reminds us that history is not a neat narrative with clear beginnings and endings, but a complex web of incomplete information, conflicting accounts, and human limitations. The case also demonstrates how criminal investigation has evolved. Modern DNA analysis, advanced forensic techniques, computerized databases, and psychological profiling might have caught Jack the Ripper had they been available in 1888. But they weren't, and so the mystery endures. A reminder of how far we've come in criminal justice, while highlighting how much we still don't understand about the human capacity for evil. Jack the Ripper has become more than a historical figure. He's become a symbol, a representation of the fear that lurks in dark places, the possibility that evil can walk among us undetected. His story continues to fascinate because it touches on fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the limits of justice. The streets of Whitechapel have long since been transformed. The doss houses and workhouses that sheltered his victims have been torn down, replaced by modern buildings. The gas lamps that cast flickering shadows on cobblestones have given way to electric lighting. Yet the shadow of Jack the Ripper remains, a permanent part of the area's identity, and a reminder of a time when terror stalked the night. As we close this investigation, we're left not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the case and the humanity of all involved, victims, investigators, and the communities that were forever changed by these crimes. The Ripper may have disappeared into the fog of Victorian London, but the questions he raised about justice, society, and human nature continue to resonate today. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of Jack the Ripper. Some mysteries are meant to endure, not because we lack the tools to solve them, but because they serve as permanent reminders of the darkness that can exist in human hearts and the eternal vigilance required to protect society's most vulnerable members. The fog has lifted from Whitechapel's streets, but the shadow of Jack the Ripper remains, as dark and mysterious as ever. This has been Serial Killer Files. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Until next time, remember that in the pursuit of truth, sometimes the questions we ask are more important than the answers we find. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Serial Killer Fillers to stay updated with the most chilling true crime podcasts.